The year 1780 was a turning point for the American Army in the Revolution. There was a strong emphasis by the British to focus their efforts in the South, especially in the Carolinas. Defeat after defeat for the Patriots was tarnishing the morale of the American forces. There were dividing lines amongst the Patriots over those who held loyalties to the British and those who found favor in rebellion. As the Tories began to tear through the South with promising victories taken by Tarleton at Monk's Corner and Charleston in April 1780, and then again by Cornwallis at the Battle of Camden in August 1780, most signs were pointing to an all-out British victory.
In a letter to Congress in April of 1780, General George Washington alluded to the problems in the South, noting that intelligence and movements by the British were proving to show their focus was southward. Washington warned Congress, "The enemy will endeavor to push their operations with vigor at the southward. The weak state of our force there, and unhappily in this quarter also, have laid me under great embarrassments with respect to the conduct that ought to be pursued. The southern states, it is to be apprehended, may require much support, and while we attempt to afford it from hence, we run a risk in this quarter from the facility with which the enemy, by the help of their fleet, can unite their force at any point where they find us weak."
Following this exchange, in June of 1780, General Henry Clinton made his way back to New York after a successful campaign in the South. He left General Cornwallis in command of the British forces with orders to push further into the interior of South Carolina and complete the mission of subduing the South. Efforts were focused by Cornwallis and his men on the Carolinas, as Banastre Tarleton recounted.
The immediate advance of the King's troops into North Carolina would undoubtedly, at this critical period, have been productive of various and important advantages. The appearance of the royal forces after such brilliant success would have animated their friends, discouraged their enemies, and continued the confusion of dispersion of the American army.
As the British continued to push further into the South, in August of 1780, the Battle of Camden brought another crushing defeat to the American forces. General Horatio Gates was defeated after trying to stage a surprise attack on the British, but running into them by mistake. As Robert Middlecoff described the aftermath of this battle, the defeat at Camden depressed Patriot spirits everywhere, but it did not stop the raids and ambushes on the part of the irregulars. This defeat also only fueled Cornwallis that much more. He began making preparations for a strong push further into the South Carolina backcountry, and again, as Middlecoff stated, began preparations for a march almost as soon as the smoke had settled at Camden, and that by September he had collected the supplies he needed and the wagons and the horses to transport them, and on the 8th began his march for Charlotte, with Hillsborough as the Army's final destination. In September, Cornwallis turned his attention to the South Carolina backcountry, hoping to gain more support and loyalists from further inside the interior of the state. Despite the plans for advancement, Cornwallis men were also in need of replenishment physically and in resources and supplies. He was not quite ready to make an all-out assault further into the Carolinas.
In order to keep alive the British interests in North Carolina, Major Ferguson's corps of Rangers and about 1,000 loyal militia were advanced to the western borders to hold communication with the inhabitants of Tryon County till the King's troops under Earl Cornwallis were in condition to advance.
While British movement and planning was taking place, also in the western part of North Carolina were several colonial militia leaders gathering their own intelligence on what the plans were for the British Army. Regular militiamen that would soon become Revolutionary War heroes were beginning to make preparations for a potential conflict with enemy forces. Those men being Isaac Shelby, John Sevier, William Campbell, Benjamin Cleveland, and Joseph McDowell. Word had begun to spread of the American defeats in 1780 and of the focus on the southern region to gain British sympathies, so there were rumblings beginning to take place throughout the western regions of North Carolina, the area of what would be Tennessee, and parts of Virginia, of an overzealous Patrick Ferguson who was scoping out the South Carolina backcountry and making his way further into the southern states on campaign for Cornwallis and the British command.
Shelby and the others received word of these preparations and began to make preparations of their own in late September of 1780. But of course, nothing about wartime plans were ever sacred for either side. As Ferguson caught wind of the preparations being made, he dispatched his own correspondence through a prisoner who by some hand of fate was a distant relative of Colonel Isaac Shelby. When the prisoner arrived, he relayed the message from Ferguson as Shelby remembered it. Of the prisoner, he said, instructed him to inform the officers on the western side that if they did not desist their opposition on the British arms and take protection under his standard, he would march his army over the mountains, hang their leaders, and lay waste to their country by fire and sword. This message would fuel the flames of resistance to the British even more for the colonial militia, and the warning from Ferguson would start the first domino in the turning of the tide of the American Revolution. In late September of 1780, intelligence gathered from the prisoner who was connected to Isaac Shelby revealed that Ferguson and his men were moving and making their way into the South Carolina backcountry. Colonial militiamen in the western part of North Carolina and what would be Tennessee began to meet and determine a plan of action. These militiamen were like many American patriots at this time. They were ready to bear arms in action against the British enemy, whom they saw as a threat to their way of life. As Ricardo Herrera put it, military service was the provenance of the virtuous militiamen in the Republican tradition, and that there was no better symbol then of the Republican arms than that of the American citizen as soldier. In the early October fall, Isaac Shelby, then commander of the group militia stationed in Sullivan County, North Carolina, traveled almost 60 miles to reach Colonel John Sevier, the commander of Washington County, North Carolina troops. He wanted to inform him of intelligence regarding the movement of Ferguson and his men. Shelby stated that after some consultation, we determined to march with all the men we could raise and attempt to surprise Ferguson by attacking him in his camp, or at any rate before he was prepared for us.
Sevier then recruited Colonel Joseph McDowell from western North Carolina, and Shelby was in charge of recruiting Colonel William Campbell and his forces from Washington County, Virginia, to take part in this fight. Due to their locations being outside of the battle location, these men were all deemed the over-mountain men, since they traversed over literal mountains to fight Ferguson. Stephen Foster described the efforts to recruit men, saying that in the two settlements was a little over 400 men. The army they were to attack was double in number and headed by the Albust partisan leader in the land.
Foster, using information left behind from Colonel Shelby, described the days leading up to the battle as Americans were beginning to arrive at Kings Mountain. He said they ascended this mountain on horseback on the 1st of October, 1780. On top of the mountain, the troops paraded. Here were 100 acres of beautiful tableland. On reaching the plain beyond the mountain, they found themselves in a country covered with verdure and breathed the atmosphere of summertime mildness. Throughout the first few days of October, leading up to the day of the battle, the colonial militias were beginning to take their places, stationed on and around Kings Mountain and the ridgeline. While the Americans were getting into place and preparing for what could be the fight of their lives, what were the British up to?
In late September, it was known that Ferguson and his men were to be stationed at Gilberttown, an area in the rural part of western North Carolina, about 40 miles west of where the colonial militia was currently stationed. In the journal of a Lieutenant Anthony Allaire, serving under Major Ferguson at the time, he described the journey that was taken by his forces between the late part of September and early October leading up to the battle. Leaving the Gilberttown area on the 29th of September, Allaire states that the group made its way at an early hour 3 miles east to the plantation of a loyalist by the name of James Stepp, where they remained until October 1st. They then spent the next 5 days moving east, across the Broad River, Buffalo Creek, and to the tiny ridge of Kings Mountain, where they arrived in the early morning hours of October 6th. Upon reaching Kings Mountain, Allaire described the scene as a march of 16 miles to Little Kings Mountain, where we took up our ground.
A historian at the University of Tennessee described the march from Gilberttown to Kings Mountain in this way. He said it was distinguished as the extreme point of British invasion in the direction of the home of the mountain men. To that place, Ferguson, in the execution of his vain threat to invade and burn up their villages, had advanced there and erected His Majesty's standard, with the double purpose of securing cooperation of the Loyalists and preventing the rising and concentration of the Whigs. Ramsey continued, saying every movement of Ferguson, from the time he left his camp at Gilberttown, indicated his apprehension to the impending danger. The cloud was gathering upon the mountain, and his loyal militia knew that it portended a storm and disastrous overthrow. As Ferguson tried to boost the morale of his men, and the colonial militia preparing at Kings Mountain, a Tory soldier from Ferguson's camp was arrested by the Americans. With him, they confiscated a letter from Ferguson to Cornwallis outlining the number of soldiers, their position, asking for reinforcements, and letting Cornwallis know that Ferguson had named the mountain Kings Mountain in honor of His Majesty. As Ramsay again stated, the contents of this dispatch were, with the exception of the number of the enemy, communicated to the riflemen. The march was resumed, their pace quickened, and they rode with a gallop within the view of the camp of Ferguson. The militias broke into two groups, surrounding the base of the ridge where the British were stationed on the top. Upon meeting, the entire group of militia was to yelp in an Indian war whoop and advance upon the enemy. A small break in the ridge allowed for them to pass through, and they were met with enemy fire. As Colonel Isaac Shelby remembered, the attack commenced by the two center columns, which attempted to ascend at the eastern end of the mountain. The battle here became furious and bloody. The outbreak of the Battle of Kings Mountain had begun.
The over-mountain men continued to push up the mountain, Shelby describing them being continually repulsed by the enemy and driven down the mountain. The back and forth of pushing from the bottom to the top of the mountain and back again began to cause much disorder and confusion on the part of the American forces. The columns were separated, but the fight continued.
The battle only lasted 65 minutes, and towards the end, the enemy made a shocking change in their tactics. Shelby again describing the events in this way. Toward the latter part of the action, the enemy made a fierce and gallant charge upon us from the eastern summit of the mountain, and drove us near to the foot of it. The retreat was so rapid that there was great danger of its becoming a rout. Ferguson sent himself and his men over the top of the ridge and down the mountain in an effort to outgun the colonial militia. But instead, the Patriots stood their ground and ended the threat on the mountain. Bannister Tarleton described the scene in this way. Action commenced at 4 o'clock in the afternoon on the 7th of October and was disputed with great bravery near an hour, when the death of the gallant Ferguson threw his whole corps into total confusion. Finally, on the website of the Kings Mountain Battleground and National Military Park, it says this: "It was here that Ferguson, the British commander, was killed, and a white flag was soon after hoisted by the enemy, in token of surrender. They were ordered to throw down their arms, which they did, and surrendered themselves, prisoners at discretion." After the Battle of Kings Mountain, the trajectory of war changed forever. Samuel Williams, using journals left behind by British soldiers, surmised this information. The unfortunate Allaire gave a new turn to the war. All the country on Cornwallis' rear was laid open to the incursions of the enemy, who, if they had made proper use of their country and this victory, might have taken both 96 and Augusta. Going further to say, "The country is wholly leagued against us. We know nothing of the enemy's operations, and our operations are always known to them." It took several months for word to reach Lord Cornwallis of the defeat of Ferguson and his troops, let alone the death of Ferguson. Cornwallis was prepared to send troops for reinforcement and to send word to Ferguson to move toward Catawba after the fight. He was hoping to continue his North Carolina campaign and hoping to have secured the South Carolina backcountry after the Battle of Kings Mountain. The after effects of the battle were long-standing. The British had underestimated not only their loyalties in the southern region, but also the threat that those loyalties presented to their expeditions. The impact of Kings Mountain had begun, even in the early days after the battle's conclusion, and its ability to make the British forces fearful of loyalties lost presented an end to the campaign in North Carolina for Cornwallis, and possibly an end to the Southern campaign's success. As a result of this battle, Cornwallis decided to leave Charlotte and bypass the Catawba River, giving orders to his army to move. After a retreat of the British forces, a regrouping was necessary on behalf of Cornwallis and the British command. They had effectively lost most of the southern region, especially in the Carolinas, and their loyalties were in jeopardy. The victory at Kings Mountain had also done much to rekindle a flame of American allegiance and independence in the southern region. With the success of the Over-Mountain Men, many on the frontier and in the interior of the Carolinas saw this as a heroic and swift effort on behalf of the Americans to evade a threat that they saw continually pushing further and further into their land and into their way of life. To have stopped Cornwallis and stumped him meant that the Americans had the advantage, and they would use that advantage to end the threat in the South and gather more loyalties and support for the American cause that would ultimately mean an end to the British Army. The battle itself, what do you think was the biggest impact it had on the American victory after the battle?
Oh man, this battle is the biggest, most important, and most unknown battle in the Revolutionary War. And that's not that much of an exaggeration. As you remember, Thomas Jefferson himself referred to this battle as the turning of the tide of the Revolution. And the reason he said that is very interesting and very surprising, because if you go into your history books, or if you go into a Google search and just say turning point of revolution, you won't find much about Kings Mountain. Because what they record there are the military battles. But if you put in turning point Kings Mountain, you'll find page after page after page after page. So the reason was, this was a group, we would say rednecks. Okay, this was a group of redneck hillbillies who had decided, no, you're not going to do this to us. We are getting wound up. We're not going to let that happen. When Ferguson sent the letter out into everybody's backyard that said, hey, I'm coming, you might as well surrender. If you don't, you can sit out and you can see your houses burned and your family's destroyed. He didn't realize that the hillbilly mentality, the mountain man mentality was, you don't threaten me. So when they got together, they fought this battle, and they fought it from a perspective that was very interesting from the redcoats. From the British side. They didn't understand in the British side what it was like to fight mountain men.
Yeah.
Okay. So the overwhelming victory at that point has got to be put into the context of what was going on with Washington's troops. Washington's troops were way up north. But one of the most depressing battles had already happened, which was the surrender of Charleston. That was a major defeat for American forces. So you've got Washington's forces up north. They just heard about this. They knew that Cornwallis was going to be sending all the way up through the Carolinas his troops, and they had already seen this major defeat. They were depleted with money. They did not have food. They didn't have outfits. They didn't have enough bullets and guns. They were demoralized. And they felt like the end was near for that. So when the Battle of Kings Mountain happened, and it was an overwhelming victory for the Patriots, you can see the shot in the arm that this gave emotionally. The emotional impact is the most important thing if you're fighting any kind of battle. It's your frame of reference, it's your mindset. So all of a sudden, when they found out about the Battle of Kings Mountain, which actually took about a month before they even understood what had happened, when they found out about that, there was a surge in the forces. There was a surge in the morale of Washington's guys. In other words, they were thinking, this is a bunch of guys who were not even in the army, and they took out Ferguson, who was a very well-known colonel for the military side in the British. So they were suddenly like, if they can do that, we can do what we're going to do.
Yeah.
And it was that fight at Kings Mountain that actually turned the tide morally, with the morale for the enthusiasm of the forces that Washington was in control of, to get that out and to help finish the job within the next year.
from Kings Mountain, what would you say the legacy of this battle is to this area?
Well, I can just say what it means to me.
Yeah.
In the Battle of Kings Mountain, the forces of the entire military surge for the Patriots was turned around. It was turned around by a bunch of guys who came together and said, we don't want this to happen. We have had enough. But the thing was, they weren't regular army. They didn't come together because they were trained. They didn't come together because they were unified under a military force. Their colonels that they had fighting in the war actually came from other people. They were volunteering also. So the impact was, here is a bunch of people, common, ordinary, regular, living everyday life folk, who decided, we've had enough of this. We're not going to let this happen to our families, to our posterity. We've worked hard for our farms. We've worked hard to build this up. We want to know where America is going. We feel like we need our liberty. We're not going to stand for this anymore. It was a regular, ordinary people. So the legacy of this to me is, I'm a regular, ordinary guy, and I can have an impact. I can do something, except I've got to draw that line. I've got to decide the things that I'm going to accept and the things I'm not going to accept anymore. And I've got to draw that line and live my life in the authority that I have liberty. And I'm going to claim that liberty, and you're not going to take it away from me. And now is a really good time for us to be revisiting that lesson in our lives, to be careful not to yield up that liberty, not to let that force come and destroy our homes and our future, but instead let's claim what it is that we belong to, what we believe in, and stake that claim out and say, no, you can't come any further than this. So yeah, I think that's a really good legacy for us to be thinking of from the people here at Kings Mountain.